Today, I am talking about something that I don't typically talk about. I focus a lot on women's mental health and women's issues, but today I want to share a bit about men and mental health, and specifically around men and depression. So, the reason I'm bringing this up because we're seeing a lot of that in our practice, and there is some confusion around what some of the symptoms might be with depression in men. So, there are some gender differences between, loosely between men and women. These are not hard and fast rules. These are loose gender differences. Now, the reason why there are some differences between men and women when it comes to mental health and mental health challenges, or how depression shows up or anxiety shows up, is because we're socialized very, very differently. And the way that we're socialized really different is that we are taught from a very young age about what is okay to talk about and what's not okay to talk about, and specifically around feelings and emotions and how we're doing. And if you think about how boys and girls are raised, we raise them very differently. And there's a lot of sayings out there that we joke about, and it's tongue in cheek, things like, boys don't cry, suck it up, man up, all these things that are sayings that we use with boys and teenagers. This is how we socialize men in our culture. And so the message is that, no matter how you're feeling, you need to suck it up. No matter how you're feeling, don't talk about it. That talking about things and sharing your emotions is a woman thing or a feminine thing that's not acceptable to for men to express themselves that way. So what happens over a lifetime is that girls are really encouraged to talk things out and to connect, and we build these social connections, and we typically have more of a community around us of female friends that we talk a lot to and we engage in. Men are socialized to be lone wolves, so to speak, to not have a lot of social connections, and if it is, they do have social connections, it's mostly around sports related or activity related. It's not about the emotional wellness. And what happens is that when these young boys turn into men, because they will, is that they have these ideas that it's not okay to talk about emotions. And they come by it honestly because that's how they're raised. And when there's some challenges around mental health, so when there's experiencing some mental health challenges, it becomes very difficult for men to talk about that. So depression shows up very differently for men than it does for women. And the number one reason, or number one way that it shows up differently is that men will typically show anger or irritation in place of that sadness that women typically will show with depression. So the apathy might be the same, like not wanting to be involved in things, but what men express is anger. And the reason for that is that because we socialize young boys to express anger more easily than sadness or hurt feelings. And this has an impact in our lifespan and how boys become teenagers and they become men, is they have this ideology and this idea within them because this is what they've been taught. And so when men are experiencing depression, it will typically show up in anger. It also will show up in this like brooding isolation. So the emotional shut offness that we can see sometimes in women as well, but in men, it's very prominent to see the emotional shutdown, the distance, the social isolation from families or their relationships, and then that irritation and that anger that seems to always be there, that short temperedness, that just whatever happens can and trigger it really quickly, and then there's a lot of conflict for no reason. Um, and this is the struggle. So then what we see is we observe someone as being angry and we say things like, you need anger management. And there's some, perhaps, their anger is an issue, but also we need to start asking some questions about how are they feeling? And maybe if depression is playing a part in the situation, because men often revert to anger and frustration because it's a more socially acceptable emotion for them. It's the only thing they're really allowed to express in general, without major consequences. Whereas there's a lot of social consequences for men who are, sensitive or expressing themselves. There's a lot of labels that we have for men. They grow up with words of insult of being too girly or too feminine, or all the other things that we call men who are too soft, has an impact on men's mental health. This is not to excuse anger in any way. This is about providing some explanation and some understanding that when we use the terms depression or we're talking about mental health or mental health wellness, that it shows up differently for genders. It shows up differently for men and women. Again, these are very loose ideas, but there is a difference of expression that men and women are socialized to have. So if you've got men in your life, and I'm sure that you do, and you might be concerned about what's going on with them, or you've seen a shift in their mood or a shift in how they're doing, really check in with them and, really point out the behavior difference versus just asking how you're feeling. Men are really used to responding to the question, how are you feeling? Fine, everything's okay. Um, and that's a habit, right? So a question to ask is, I've noticed that you've been more irritable lately. Can you tell me about why that is? I've noticed that you've been really emotionally shut off lately, and you can give some examples. How are you really doing? This pandemic has hit all of us really, really hard and in very different ways. And we are seeing the ripple effect of shelter in place and quarantine and being isolated and job losses and relationship losses. There's so much change, and I think that we're so used to not really checking in with the men in our lives. And I really encourage you to think about maybe some behavior changes you might be seeing in someone you care about and someone you love, and check in on them about what this is, and knowing that men are not socialized to talk about feelings, and you may have to push a little bit. And if you're a guy and you're listening to this, take a leap of faith and express really how you're doing and how you're feeling, and that people really care and really want to know what's going on with you. So I hope this adds a little bit to your day, and I hope you check in with some men in your life and see how they're doing, and makes you think a little bit maybe of how depression shows up for men. That may be a little bit different than your own experiences.